L'kutei Sichos Chelek Chaf Hey, Toldos, Sicha Aleph, Lili Nishmas Rabbi Yosef ben Yamin ben Rabbi Moshe Kaltman. Today we're going to learn a fascinating Rashi Sicha that explores Esav's dishonesty. The question is, what does Esav's dishonesty consist of? And we'll see the words that Rashi chooses are precise for the message that he wants to give us. Let us begin. In Pasuk Vayigdulu Hanaorim Vayhi Esav Ish Yedei Atzayid Isada, the Pasuk says that the lads grew up, meaning Yankov and Esav. Esav was a hunter, a man of the field. Stellt sich Rashi auf die Werte Yedei Atzayid. Rashi quotes the words, he knew how to hunt. Und is mefarish and explains Lotzud ulerames es aviv bepiv. Not only did he know how to hunt in the literal sense, but it means he knew how to trap and deceive his father with words. V'shayale, he would ask him, Abba heyach ma'asen es hamelech v'sateven. Father, how does one tithe from salt or from straw? Kisavar aviv, this made his father think, shehu medaktik b'mitzvahs, that he's meticulous with mitzvahs. What does this mean? Learn in Mefarshim. So the Mefarshim on Rashi, the basic Rashi Mefarshim explain, Ados was Esav had gefragt wegen Melach und Teven Tavka. The fact that Esav asked about salt and straw is weil sie sein in den ganzen Potter von Meiser Ech mit Rabbanan. Because salt and straw are exempt from Meiser, even with the Rabbanan. Because Meiser has to be Gidule Karka, things that grow in the ground. And Melach, of course, doesn't grow in the ground. Salt, and even straw, it does come from the ground, but it's not edible. It's not something that's used for food, and therefore it's exempt from Meiser. So Esav would ask about something that wasn't chayiv, wasn't obligated from in Meiser. Under mitot Esav gewollt weisen, as is as viel medaktik b'mitzvahs, bis as git Meiser ech von Sachen, v'chas eine pater Meiser. And with this, Esav would prove that he is so meticulous with mitzvahs that he's going beyond the letter of the law and he's bringing meiser, giving meiser, even for things that are exempt from meiser. That's the way the Mefarshim explain this Rashi. That al pi halacha, both melach and teven, salt and straw, are exempt from meiser, and by asking this question to his father, how should I give meiser from melach and teven, he was telling his father, look how meticulous I am, look how careful I am with mitzvahs. Al pi says number two. If this is the pshat in Rashi, this raises a number of questions. And the first question is as follows: When Esav wollte peil mafresh given meiser von melach und teven, had he done this in actuality, that could have been used to prove how meticulous he is in mitzvahs. But by asking the question how to separate meiser is nit bloß as der mitoter nit gekent ausnehmen bei Yitzchaken. Not only does this not impress Yitzchak, because it's just a question, he's not seeing anything that's being done, nor adarabba, it's worse than that. Warum der Shaila weist Gott auf sein Amaratzes, as weiß nicht hilchas meiser. By asking, how do you give meiser? How do you separate meiser from salt or from straw? It actually shows Esav's ignorance. He doesn't know the halacha. He doesn't know that you don't give meiser on these things. So had he done so, you could say, wow, look how frum he is. But if he's asking the question, the question itself is not impressive, nor does it prove that he knows anything. It makes him look like he doesn't know anything. Nochmer, let's take this question a step further. Esav sich doch gehad wird bei Yitzchak in den Stub as 8 Jahren von sein Kindheit und Jugend. Esav was raised in Yitzchak's house throughout his childhood, through his youth. Und Eber ist Taka Azav versucht zu sein bedaktik mit mitzvahs. If he is such a kind of person that is so scrupulous about mitzvahs, wie sich gewollt herausweisen as he wanted to show, hat gewiss nachgeguckt, wie Yitzchak ist mit kein mitzvahs. So he certainly would have observed as a child how his father Yitzchak was doing the mitzvahs. Und hat sicher gedacht bemerken, as Yitzchak gibt nicht kein Meiser from Melech v'Teven. And he certainly would have noticed that Yitzchak does not give Meiser, does not separate Meiser, does not tithe from salt or straw. Heint, via ze hat gemeint ausnehmen bei Yitzchak in mit der Scheile, heyach maasen v'chulu. So how does he want to impress Yitzchak with the question, how does one give meiser from these things? Yitzchak will already say to himself, if he was sincere about this, he would know already. He would have noticed over all the years that this is not something that you give meiser from. So similar to the question of his ignorance, it also shows that he wasn't really keeping track of what was going on in the house, which does not make him seem as a person that is very meticulous in mitzvahs. The Tmiyah is not grosser. So besides the fact that this doesn't reflect so well on Esav, now the question on Rashi is also a big question. Der Teichen von Pirush Rashi zeh, wie Esav hat gewollt beweisen Yitzchakin, als is a medaktik b'mitzvahs, steht sei in den Chum und sei in Bereishis Rabbah. This idea, which Rashi brings, that Esav wanted to show how careful he is, how scrupulous he is in mitzvahs, and therefore asked this question, is brought in two different medrashim, in Medrash Tanchuma and in Medrash Rabbah. In Tanchuma steht es mit Hashin Nilashon. Tanchuma brings it with a little bit of a different wording. As Esav gefragt Yitzchakin, mahu shetei chayebes b'mais. That Esav was asking Yitzchak, are these things obligated in Meiser? Aber in Bereishis Rabbah steht bedemet zum Lashon was Rashi sagt befiloshe. The Bereishis Rabbah, the Tanchuma said that Esav was asking whether it was mechuyev, whether it was he was obligated to separate Meiser from it. The Bereishis Rabbah brings a language, brings a wording that is more similar to Rashi, which the Medrash Rabbah says that he asked, Heyach mesaknin milcha. How do you fix? How do you prepare the salt? Meaning, how do you bring meiser and make it and off the salt and make it usable? Heyach mesaknin tivna or tavna. How do you fix or prepare straw? Was von dem Loschen ist Maß, wie wir vorher sagen, das, was Melech und Teven seine Mechuyev in Meiser, ist bei Esav nicht Kitzafik nicht given. From this word, when you say, how do I do this, it implies that Esav was certain that it was obligated in Meiser. So Shaila is not given, hey, ach, Masnas Melech was a Teven. His question was how. It wasn't if, it was how. Kumtois. So if Rashi is not going with the Tanchuma, which says that Esav was asking the question whether he's mechuyev, and instead Rashi uses the Medrash Rabbah, which implies that Esav was certain that he was mechuyev to bring meiser. Kumtois. This implies as Rashi klaiptos davke dem nusach. The Rashi chooses specifically the version, was is noch magdil alif de marasas von Esav, which exacerbates, number one, Esav's ignorance, as by him is bothered as Melech Teven and Chayv Meiser, because he is certain that the Melech and Teven, that salt and straw are obligated in Meiser. Beis, it also exacerbates the problem that nit b'American that Yitzchak ain't Meiser Melech Teven. The fact that Esav never noticed that Yitzchak is not giving Meiser from these things. In other words, if the question was, are you Chayiv? Then the fact that he didn't notice exactly is smaller, because he's asking, did you not? At least he's questioning it. But if you're saying that Esav is certain that you don't bring that you don't bring meiser, that you do bring meiser, it means he was totally not observing what his father was doing, which does not make him to seem to be a medaktik b'mitzvahs. So that's the Rebbe's first two questions. Now the first question is really on the story according to Rashi. What is it really? How does this really prove Esav's frumkeit? And the other question is why Rashi chooses to go with the version of the Bereishis Rabbah and not the version of Tanchuma, which would make it a little bit more understood. In Siv Beis, the Rebbe is going to ask another question. It's going to actually lead us back to this question on Rashi. But the first question that he asks, what does it even mean? How do you separate meiser? Yeder veist and pashton tights from meiser atzentel. Anybody knows that what is a meiser? A tenth. Is in was besteht die Shaila heach maasrin? Wie as they nemen a meiser atzentel from Melech v'Teven? It's basic math. What's mean? How do you give meiser? How to take off 10% of salt or straw? Oh, so this is the Rebbe's second question, the third question really. What does it even mean? What does the question even mean? You're trying to bring a point that I'm very from, that I'm giving meiser. So then give meiser, measure how much you have, take off 10% and give. What's he even asking, Heyach Ma'asrin? Now the Rebbe says, if we go back to the Medrash, now another thing that we didn't point out is even though the Rashi uses the Bereishis Rabbah and not the Tanchuma, but even in that Rashi changes. The Medrash said the word misaknin, which means to rectify, to fix it. and which literally we're understanding it to mean that when you give meiser, then the rest of it becomes usable. So you're preparing it. But they use mesaknin. Rashi changes from mesaknin and uses me'asrin. So the Rebbe says no. In Medrash came noch entferin. As die Shaila und die Shaila anal Sif Aleph wird bewahren bediuk loshna Medrash heach mesaknin milcha heach mesaknin tivna und nicht heach me'asrin. The Medrash that uses the words mesaknin, with the word mesaknin, that actually can answer the questions. Both the question about Esav's ignorance and also the question about what he means by heach, how. Because we can explain that certainly Esav knew that salt and straw are exempt from Meiser. His question is, how do you rectify it? Meaning to say, since we know that from when it comes to agricultural things, you have to bring Meiser. Meiser is also a concept of giving every 10th animal as Meiser, to prove that the Eibishter owns the world. So those things that are exempt from Meiser, there should have to be something that we have to do to rectify it, as that they too should have some sort of sign that they come from Hashem. Und das ist Shailas Esav Eich Mesaknin Milcha Tivna. Not according to the Medrash that uses the word Mesaknin, you could say the Medrash isn't asking how to tithe. The Esav knows that you don't have to tithe. The Medrash is asking, Esav is asking, how do you fix it? How can you prepare it and make some sort of sign that it comes from Hashem if you're not giving Meiser? And this answers the first question in Seif Aleph, where we said it seems that Esav seems ignorant. Esav is not ignorant at all. Esav knows that there's no Meiser. He's asking, what else could I do to show that this is from Hashem without giving Meiser? And now the second question that we asked now in Sif Beis, what is Esav asking? How do you give Meiser? Also falls away. He wasn't asking how to tithe. Tithing he knows. Those things that need Meiser, he knows how it works. It's 10%. But here he's asking a different question. He was asking how to fix it so that we should know that it comes from Hashem. So if you were to use the term misaknin, which is what the Medrash uses, then the two questions that we asked on this pirush go away. And in that case, the question goes back on Rashi. So why does Rashi change from the words of the Medrash, which are the source, one of the sources of this Rashi? So why does Rashi change from the word misaknin to ma'asrin, which, according to the Mefarshim that we quoted in the beginning of the Sikha, that Esav was pretending to be very extra frum by saying asking how to tithe, if, as the Rebbe asked the question, number one, it seems that Esav is ignorant from the halacha. It seems that Esav was not really aware of what was going on in his house, and he's asking a stupid question. He's asking how to give Meiser when anybody knows that Meiser is 10%. So now the Rebbe begins the bir. The Rebbe is going to take us and totally shift our perspective on what Esav is asking when he says Heach Ma'asrin. But first, the Rebbe introduces this detail. As Rashi is mefarish b'pshuti shel mikra leibasi l'pshuti shel mikra afilu v'endos is nit behas mit chilek halacha shebetera. The Rashi is coming to explain the basic pshat of the Torah, and therefore sometimes that will be inconsistent with halacha. Which means to say, Rashi is teaching the words. So even if this doesn't work exactly with the halacha shebetayda, doesn't change the fact that Rashi is still teaching the words of the Chumash. So in other words, sometimes Rashi's pirush will be inconsistent with halacha, but it doesn't matter because pshutei shel mikra does not have to be consistent with halacha. So using this concept in our case, the Shaila Heach Ma'asin es Hamelach Vasateven in Pirush Rashi is nicht verbunden mit der Mitzvah von Meises Roim Shlach Matan Torah. When Rashi says that Esav was asking how to tithe from salt and straw, he was not referring to the mitzvah of Meiser that is written into the Torah and is applicable to Yidden after Matan Torah. Nor mit mitzvahs Meiser was hat demult neue given le Pshuta Shel Mikra. But according to Pshuta Shel Mikra, we're going to discover that there was another kind of Meiser that is not the same thing as the Meiser that is part of halacha later on. There was a different Meiser, which may not be a halacha, but according to Pshuta Shel Mikra, it was happening. And that's what Esav is referring to, and once we realize that, that'll answer our questions. And the Rebbe explains. In Parshas Lech Lecha it tells us that after Avram was victorious over the 4 kings that had taken Lot hostage, it says in the pasuk, Malki Tzedek Melech Shalem, Goimar, V'hu Kohen Goimar, Vayitin Loi Meiser Mikael. That Malki Tzedek was the Kohen, and Avram gave him Meiser from everything. Is Rashi Mefarish, Vayitin Loi Avram Meiser Mikael Asher Loi, Lefi Shoya Kohen. Says Rashi that Avram gave Malki Tzedek Meiser, a tenth, a tithe, from everything that he owned, because he was a Kohen. Now the Rebbe explains what Rashi is telling us. In that Rashi, Parshas Lech Lecha. Aleph, Avram had given Meiser to Malki Tzedek Shoya Kohen. Number 1, Avram was giving Meiser. That's point number 1. Beis, Mikol Asher Loi. That he gave Meiser from everything that he owned. Mefarshim explained, what is Rashi telling us? Mikol Asher Loi. As der mit meint Rashi Shelol sein, dem Pirush, as der Meiser, was Avram hat gegeben, is bleib gewesen von Shlal Milchama. There are others that claim that Rashi, and we'll see this later in the Sikha, that Avram was giving Malki Tzedek spoils of war. He was giving him 10% of the spoils of war. Says Rashi, no, Mikol Asher Loi. He was giving Meiser from everything, not just from the spoils of war. Why? Because we see clearly in the pasuk, in a different pasuk. The pasuk is dort gleich mamshich, as the pasuk continues, as Avram had gesagt imichut v'goymer v'im ekach mikol asher lach, that Avram told the king of Sdom, not even a shoelace will I take from you. As it had garnered genommen from the Mishlal Sdom, that Avram took nothing from the spoils of Sdom. So therefore, you can't al pipsut Shel Mikra that Avram didn't get anything from, didn't gain anything from the spoils of war. So he couldn't have been giving Meiser from it because there was nothing there to give Meiser from. Therefore, Rashi says, no, their Meiser is going to be Mikol Asher Loi. So therefore, Mikol Asher Loi means that he gave Meiser from everything, which would include even things that will be halacha later on are patur from Meiser. Even things that later on are exempt from Meiser, because this was a different Meiser that's not connected to the halacha that comes later on in the Torah, Avram gave Mikol Asher Loi. Zetman, as Avram Zachneg, when it's to give Meiser Mikol Asher Loi, La Avram. So we see that Avram's custom was to give Meiser from everything that he owned. Von alle seine Nechasim, Kimafurish Frier, Tzayin, Gamer, Vavadim, Gamer, Kasev Ezav. That from everything that he owned, from his sheep, from his servants, from his gold and silver, Avram gave Meiser from everything. He meets Malki Tzedek, and he says, whatever I own, he makes a cheshbon, and he gives him Meiser for everything. And since one of the qualities of Avram was that he commanded his children and his household to follow in his ways, and they too should keep and do righteousness and justice, is move on as Eichis hat sich als ein gegeben und hat gegeben Meister nicht nur von seiner Tvue, wie Rashi bringt weiter auf den Pasuk zu geben mehr Sharim, the Meister Mikol Asher Loi. Later in Parashas Toldos we find that Yitzchak was giving Meister from the things that were growing, but being that he was the son of Avram, and Avram gave Meister Mikol Asher Loi from everything that he owned, not just from the produce, so clearly Yitzchak was doing the same. Which let me just say to me, sir, Rebbe Azer here a word. The fact that Yitzchak was giving Meiser would work according to all Pirushim, even those who believe that there was no such thing as Meiser before Matan Torah, or that Avram wasn't giving Meiser. Still, it makes sense. It's this kind of Meiser. Still, it makes sense that Yitzchak was giving Meiser. Why? Well, Avram had b'kayim ben kol ha-Torah kula, koilech mitzvot tzedakah. Because Avram was keeping the whole Torah, and therefore he was giving tzedakah. How much is the proper amount to give tzedakah? 10% of your principal earnings. When Yitzhak is born of Gemelas tzedakah, and he raised his children to give tzedakah. So even without this whole concept of Vayitin leMeiser Mikoil, we could still say that Yitzchak was giving Meiser because Avram was giving tzedakah. And probably if he was giving tzedakah, it was probably 10%. And so Yitzchak was giving 10%. So the Rebbe in this last a few paragraphs, the Rebbe is introducing the fact that despite the fact that there is a halacha of Meiser, Yitzchak was giving Meiser, not as part of the halacha that which is about gidule karka, things that grow in the ground. Specifically, he was giving Meiser from everything that he owned because that's what he learned from his father. Now we can understand what Esav was saying, what Esav was asking, as he was trying to impress his father with his question, how do you tithe when it comes to salt or straw? Because Yitzchak did separate Meiser from straw and from salt. Because he was giving Meiser from everything that he owned. So now, our first question was, Esav looks ignorant. Not at all. Because the Meiser that we're talking about is a Meiser that includes salt and straw. And you can't say he wasn't observing what was going on in his house, because had he been observing what was going on in the house, he would have seen that Yitzchak is giving Meiser from salt and from straw. And that's why Rashi uses the word ma'asrin, as we'll see more at length later in the Sikha, because it was taka called Meiser. It was taka, an act of giving 10%, despite the fact that it was unrelated to the mitzvah of Meiser, to the halacha of Meiser that comes later in the Torah. So all of our questions are answered. The one question that was not answered is only why Esav asks, hey, what's Esav asking? If you're giving 10%, then you know you're giving 10%. The shayla von Esav is blazgen heyach ma'asrin chulu kidul kamon. So in the next seif, we're going to explain what is Esav's actual question. In other words, the fact that Esav was asking how to give Meiser from Melech and Teven makes sense now, because since in those days Avram was doing it, and Yitzchak was doing it, therefore Esav was pretending that he too wanted to do it, and he was he was asking the question how. What is his question? Is explained as follows. Der Tzadashava von Melech und Teven in sehr Anderskeit legabe andere Sachen ist, was für sich allein haben sie nicht kein größer Chashivus, aber beschas man mischt zusammen mit einer anderen Sache, hat man von sie Atieles, was es Shalei be'erech mer wie sie Atieles b'fnei Atzmam. Something that is unique about Melech and Teven, that's salt and straw, that is different than most other items out there, is that both of them on their own individually they are worth very little, and they have very little value, very little purpose. That purpose, yes, but very little importance. But once you mix them into something else, all of a sudden their value becomes so much greater than when they were on their own. And the Rebbe is going to show both examples. As a claim, you have a little bit of salt that on its own is worth not even a penny, and it has no importance. But if you pour it into a food, it gives the food taste. And it makes the food valuable so much more than the value of a grain of salt. Not only are you adding some extra taste, without the salt you can't even eat the food. As the pasuk says, can you eat something bland without salt? So not only are you making it tastier, you're taking something that was not edible, not really edible, and you're making it edible. So you took a little grain of salt, that were you cleaning the table at the end of the meal, you would brush it off straight into the garbage. But now you took that salt and you threw it into a salad or a soup or whatever it is, and now that salt has added so much value to the food. Straw by itself, either as fodder for the animals or as firewood, is fire to heat up the fireplace, has very little value. But if you're using straw to make bricks for a building, in the brick, the straw has so much more value. So both Melach and Teven have this unique quality that on their own they're practically worthless, but as you mix them in with something else, they gain a whole new value. And this is Esav's question. Like this kind of meiser, not the halacha, not the regular meiser, but the meiser that was happening before Matan Torah. That he was giving meiser from everything, which means he was doing beyond what the halacha would have demanded. Had it been after Matan Torah, he was giving 10% from everything that he owns. So one might suggest, that you don't calculate the meiser based on the value of this little bit of salt as it is right now by itself. The meiser behema, like the meiser behema that you just give every 10th one, and you don't look at it as how the value of what it might become later on. Nor later Shabbos when I would think no. I would think if you're going to calculate the meiser, calculate the value of it once it's inside of the food. And the Rebbe in Ara 32 star points out that Mikol Asher Loi doesn't mean from every species, or doesn't mean from the overall sum total of his ownership, 10%. So if you have different things, you count how many cucumbers he has and how many tomatoes he has, and give 10% of each one individually, or do you look at everything that he owns together and give it a value and then give 10%? Because if it's the second case, then you look at the salt together with the food and the value is more. Since one might say so, this raises a question with regards to the salt and the straw. Should you, when you're paying when you're separating the meiser on salt and straw, should you look at it as they are right now, although their value is minimal, or should you look at their value once they've been mixed in and added taste to the food? This is Esa's question. So now, according to Rashi is telling us that before Matan Torah, in the time of Avraham and Yitzchak, there was a certain kind of meiser that's unrelated to the halachas of meiser. That meiser was mikol asher loi, an overall meiser from everything that he owned. And because Avraham did it, Yitzchak did it as well. The question then Esav, who wanted to deceive his father, asks this question: when it comes to Teven, when it comes to salt and to straw, should I give meiser from its current value, or should I give meiser from the value once it is mixed in with other things? And with this we can actually also explain the word of Rashi, medaktek. Medaktek means to be meticulous or precise. As there's mekayim di mitzvahs kitikunon mit dem gresten diktuk beches mekayitze that Esav wanted to show how meticulous he is in the mitzvah, that he's calculating every last penny. Whereas, according to the Mefarshim, which we brought in the beginning of the Sikha, that Esav was giving meiser from things that were not obligated in meiser, and this is how he wanted to impress his father. Then to say that he was stringent in mitzvahs, or he wanted to make mitzvahs more beautiful by going beyond the letter of the law, would have been a more appropriate choice of words. But when you use the word medaktik, it shows how you're counting, you're calculating very, very specifically, which works according to this pshat, that he wasn't giving meiser for something that he wasn't mechuyev to give meiser. Everyone was giving meiser from Melech and Teven. The question was, should I do it like this or like that? Should I do it to this value or that value? Which fits the word medaktik so much more. And the Rebbe says in the Ara, and this is not something that Esav would have known as a child, to see exactly how much Melech or Teven is giving. He would have noticed that Yitzchak was giving meiser from the salt and from the straw, but to know exactly how he calculated it, that is not something that you could notice just by observing from the side. So that question is not a question once we learn this pshat. So up until here, what we've done is we've answered the Rebbe's questions. In other words, the Rebbe changed. The Mefarshim's taich is that Melech and Teven are not mechuyev b'maiser, and Esav was pretending to give maiser for something that's not mechuyev. And because of that, the Rebbe asked a number of questions. Hey, the question makes him look ignorant, and he should have known because he would have seen what his father had done, and it doesn't even make sense. Why is he asking how to give maiser if everyone knows what maiser is? And the Rebbe explained, no, that it's not talking about that meiser, the halachic meiser. It's talking about a special meiser that was not relevant for future generations. It's only relevant, it was only done in time of Avram and Yitzchak, etc. And so Avram did it meiser mikoil, so Yitzchak did meiser mikoil. So Esav saw that his father gives meiser even for Melech and Teven, and in order to impress his father, he said, what kind of cheshbon should I make when I'm preparing the meiser for the Melech and the Teven? In Sif Hey, the Rebbe is going to go into Inyanim Ufloim, which very often is more from a halachic perspective, and the Rebbe is going to address the difference between Misaknin and Ma'asrin. The Medrash said, Heyach Misaknin, as a melach, as a milcha. What was the lashon over there? Heyach Misaknin milcha, and Heyach Misaknin tivno. And Rashi says, Heyach Ma'asrin. And the Rebbe is going to say that these two lashonos, these two terms, are dependent on a machloikis between the Rambam and Ravid. From the Yonim Ufloim al derech halacha in the Pirush Rashi. With the month free receive base as in Medrash is the lashon heyach mesaknin, or Rashi is heyach ma'asrin. Yishleimar at the shini al l'shenis is totally in the Ptuktis for Rambam and Ravid. The Rebbe is going to suggest that the two different choices of words is dependent on a machloikis between the Rambam and Ravid, as follows. In Hilchas Malachim read the Rambam wegen die mitzvahs welche seinen given kedem Matan Torah. In Hilchas Malachim, towards the end of Rambam, the whole Mishnah Torah, the Rambam talks about the mitzvahs that were given or that existed before Matan Torah. So the Rambam says, there were 6 mitzvahs that Adam Rishon was given. These are 6 of the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, minus Eivrim and Achai. Chulu, and then it says Noach was commanded Eivrim and Achai. But Avram v'nitztav chulu came Avram and he was commanded on mitzvahs milah. V'hu hispalel shachris, and Avram introduced shachris. V'Yitzchak hifresh meiser, and Yitzchak separated meiser. This is a reference to Parashas Toldos, where it says that Yitzchak grew v'yimtza mea sha'arim, and the Rashi says over there that he would give meiser, and then every time he gave meiser, his fields would grow tenfold. So Yitzchak is the first one that does meiser. That's what the Rambam says. Zok teruv the Ravid. The Rambam should have said that Avram was the first one to do meiser, as we just learned. Vayitin le'meiser mikoil, that Avram gave Malki Tzedek meiser mikoil, implying that the 10% that Avram was mafresh meiser. Learn him Mefarshim. So you basically have machlekes. The Rambam holds that Yitzchak was the first person to give meiser, and the Ravid holds that Avram was the first person to give meiser. So how do you explain the machlekes? Learn him Mefarshim. As the Rambam and Ravid and the Mechulik in the Pirush Vayitin leMeiser Mikol v'Shteit be'Avram. The Rambam and the Ravid are arguing what does it mean when it says Vayitin leMeiser Mikol. Late in the Rambam is that Vayitin leMeiser nit given together von Afrashos Meiser v'Mitzvahs Meiser Shlach Matan Torah. According to the Rambam, when it says that Avram gave Meiser, this has nothing to do with the idea of separating a Meiser that comes after Matan Torah. Varum in a Meiser nehages ele begedul karka shaloi, because the halacha is that Meiser only applies to things that grow in the ground. So if you say Vayitin le Meiser mikoil, it can't be Meiser. So then what was it? Nor does it given belois Meiser from the Mishalol Shabal Yodai. It was Meiser from the spoils of war that he received. With the Ragachav as Mevayr as listed to the Rambam is a Meiser given bedukmas mitzvahs trumas amachas from the Shvi umalkeach was when a group of Melchemes Midyon. The Ragachav explains that according to the Rambam, the Meiser that Avram gave to Malki Tzedek was similar to the tax that was put on the Yidden from the spoils of war when they returned from the war with Midyon. Was the mitzvah is nit nehages laderis. And this is not a mitzvah that is applicable in the generations to come, and therefore the Rambam doesn't have to mention it. Okay, so there's a few pratim over here. The Rambam is not following Pshuta Shel Mikra, that there was no spoils of war. According to the Rambam, there was spoils of war, and Vayitin leMeiser Mikol refers specifically to the spoils of war, and therefore what Avram did was not Meiser. Avram did not start the mitzvah of Meiser, because the only thing that he gave was the shot from the Shalosh Bali Yodai. And therefore, the Rambam says that Yitzchak Ifrish Meiser. The Yitzchak is the first one that actually engages in the mitzvah of Meiser. Shaking Leighton Ravid, it doesn't get the mitzvah Meiser. The Ravid holds that 100% what Avram gave was Meiser. And therefore, that Ravid holds that the Rambam should have said that Avram was the first one to give Meiser, because he holds that Vayitin LeMeiser Mikael was Meiser. In Halacha, the Meiser has to be from Gidulei Karka. And here it says, Vayitin LeMeiser Mikael. So the Rebbe in the brackets will answer this question in two ways. So Meila, according to the Rambam, it was giving Meiser, it wasn't halachas of Meiser b'chlal. Again, we're not talking Pshuta Shal Mikra anymore. Now we're talking halacha. So halacha, there's one halacha, there's halacha of Meiser. So the Rambam says this does not fit into the halacha of Meiser, because he was giving it from the spoils of war. The Trumas HaMeches was a special tax on spoils of war. The David says no, he was giving Meiser. Fragt the Rebbe, in that case, why was he giving Mikoil? If Meiser includes only Gidulei Karka, things that grow in the ground, is Yeshlema, the Rebbe answers as follows. Aleph, der Tanai is a chiddush was hat sich aufgetan erst nach Matan Torah. The detail, the condition that it has to be things that grow in the ground, that was introduced after Matan Torah. Whereas the Meiser before Matan Torah was of everything without any exceptions, as the pasuk says, from everything. And if you're going to say 1 second, if this is the Meiser from after Matan Torah, then why does it have different halachas? Says the Rebbe in the parentheses, was the Avos am Mekayim given as is eine nicht getan geworden mit nach Matan Torah. Like we find other mitzvahs that the Avos did before Matan Torah, and they weren't done in the same way as they have to be done today after Matan Torah. The example that Rebbe brings in Ha'ara 44, the mitzvah of Milah. That in mitzvah of Milah, there's also a mitzvah you have to do Priya. Priya is an additional removal of the foreskin. So the halacha today is mal v'lei para kil mal. If you did Milah and not Priya, then it's not a Milah. But before Matan Torah, there was no Priya. So we see that the mitzvah of Milah began before Matan Torah, but then certain details were added after Matan Torah. I don't know if this is a fair example, but we know what Chassidus always talks about, that Yaakov put on tefillin, did the mitzvah of tefillin with makles, with the black and white sticks that he put by the troughs when he was feeding the animals. So I don't know if that's a perfect example, but he was fulfilling the mitzvah of tefillin, at least the Yechudim al Yonim, the things that happen in the supernal worlds through the mitzvah, even though he wasn't doing it with black boxes and black straps as the way we do it today. The Rebbe in this Pnim gives another example. For example, the mitzvah of Yibum, which in English is called levirate marriage, which is the idea, the mitzvah, that if a woman loses her husband without having any children from him, there's a mitzvah on the husband's brother to marry her, and that way to carry the name of his brother. And today we don't do Yibum, we do Chalitza, which is a process that exempts the brother from actually marrying her, but it has to go through a specific process. Before Matan Torah, this was either a brother or a father or a relative. After Matan Torah, it's only a brother, and that's it. So we see that certain mitzvahs existed before Matan Torah, and yet, and also Yehuda, one of the reasons that Yehuda was allowed to marry Tamar was because she was first married to his sons, and they died without having children. So the mitzvah of Yibum was upon him, even though he wasn't a brother of the first husband or even of the second husband, but as a father of the husband, he could fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum. So we see that the mitzvah existed beforehand, but the details changed. So the same thing over here, the mitzvah of Meiser existed even before Matan Torah, and therefore Avram gave Meiser. But the details changed, that after Matan Torah, it became exclusive to Gedulei Karka. That's one way. That's one answer. Another answer base, Meiser da Avram is going to derech Meiser Ksafim, that the Meiser of Avram was more similar to the Meiser that we give from our money. Even if you're going to say that Ma'aseh Ksaf is only Medarabanan, here you're trying to tell me mitzvahs that began before Matan Torah. A mitzvah Derabanan was only introduced Medarabanan. It's not really a pre-Matan Torah mitzvah. So first of all, let's ask now, is Vayishmer Tereisai Lavi Tereisai Peh? First of all, we know from the pasuk Vayishmer says to Mitzvah Chukai Tereisai. So we learn from that pasuk that the Aves, the forefathers, they kept even Tereisai Peh, even things that were Medarabana. But besides for that point, is as verbunden mit und atetzov and mitzvahs meiser. Meiser of money is actually an offshoot of the regular meiser from things that grow on the ground. Mustafar learned their sifri aris meiser ksafim from pasuk aser to aser, which is why we learn it from aser to aser, which is about meiser behem, meiser zroim, meiser that comes from things that come from the ground, and meiser ksafim, meiser of money, is learned from the same pasuk, from the same parasha. Und der Riber is mitzvahs meiser in allgemein misyachas viten the meiser de Avram. So now we can connect them all. In other words, the Meiser that Avram was giving was Meiser Ksafim, but Meiser Ksafim is connected to Meiser Zroim, and therefore the Meiser Zroim that's after Matan Torah connects back to the Meiser Ksafim, the Meiser of money that Avram was giving. So whether you're saying that it was Meiser Ksafim, or you're saying that it was Meiser Zroim, but before Matan Torah, it included many more things besides just Gidulei Karka, what the Ravid holds is that what Avram was giving was connected to the mitzvah of Meiser. So here you have Machlekes of Rambam and Ravid. Did Avram give Meiser that was connected to the mitzvah of Meiser, which the Rambam says no, because it was just Trumas Ameches, it was a tax on the spoils of war, and then Ravid holds yes, despite the fact that there were some differences, but the general idea that Avram was doing was the mitzvah of Meiser. Al Pisa Yesh Leimar, so now that we have Machlekes Rambam and Ravid, now we can go back to the Medrash and Rashi. As the chiluk zwischen Pirush HaMedrash and Rashi is totally in the look down now. L'das HaMedrash is v'yitin the Meiser Mikhail nit gonna get it from mitzvahs Meiser. The Medrash holds that what Avram was giving was not Meiser. When we bow that mitzvahs Meiser is not from Gedulei Karka, and since according to the Medrash, you can only give Meiser if it's something that grows from the ground. Hotnit kin orti shai leheach ma'asnas melach. You can't ask the question, how do you tithe from salt? Because salt is not Gedulei Karka, and therefore there's no Meiser from salt. Therefore, the Medrash says that the question was how to rectify it. Canal Sif Beis, as the Rebbe explained in Sif Beis, that since you're not giving Meiser from it, how do you show that that it came from the Eibishter? That's the Medrash's approach. Again, the Medrash doesn't have to follow Sudish al-Mikra. So therefore, the Medrash could say that what Avram was doing was giving 10% of the spoils of war, which was a one-time thing, and it had nothing to do with the mitzvah of Meiser. And there's no Meiser when it comes to things that are not growing in the ground. And therefore, Melach and Teven do not have the mitzvah of Meiser. And therefore, the question is not Hayach Ma'asrin, because there is no Meiser. If you said that the question was Hayach Ma'asrin, the question would be Esav looks ignorant, and therefore the Medrash says that Esav was asking Hayach Masakrin, which is less ignorant, because he was asking how to show L'Shamar Atzum Loya even on salt and straw. Rashi led into Ober Canal Siv Gimel as written Lamesa Mikil as Ageder from Mitzvahs Meiser. But if we go back to the beer of the Sikh in Siv Gimel, that according to Rashi it was in the category of Meiser. Only Balder Meiser is Mikoil. And since the Meiser that was being given in those days was from everything, even things that are not Gidulei Karka, which means even including Melach and Teven, the Riber is Masn the Shaylech, Masn the Melach and Teven. Now the question is a good question. Esav knows that as children of Avram, we give Meiser from everything, including Melach and Teven. He watched his father do so. He just doesn't know. Heyach, do you calculate it based on it by itself, or do you calculate it as it is inside of another food, where then its value is much greater? So you have. So once we understood the Rashi, now we wanted to go back and say why Taka's Rashi use words different than the Medrash, and we answered that at least in using the perspective of Halacha Shabbatera, that there's Machlekes Rambam and Ravid, and Rashi in Psutei Shel Mikra is leaning in the Shita of the Ravid that there was Meiser of Avram, and there by Avram there was Meiser, regular Meiser, except that it was broader than Gedulei Karka. There was Melech and Teven, and therefore included Melech and Teven. And therefore Esav was asking Heyach. The Rebbe is going to ask another question here, which will be answered Dafke according to Pneumius Torah, according to Chassidus. The question is the Cheder is the Chalf Nit Glatik. Now, so the question is, why does Esav zero in on these two items? There must be other items that have a similar characteristic as that if you use them together with other things, they become much more important. Much more important than they would be if you use them by themselves. Is there bir pnimi in them? No, we have to really understand why Esav zeroes in on Melech and Teven. Al pi Chasidus, we're going to see that Dafke, Melech, and Teven connect specifically to the idea of Esav. Is there bir pnimi in them? So the explanation, according to Chassidus, is as follows. First, we have to ask a different question. Since Yitzchak knew that the name of Hashem is not frequent in Esav's speech, this was obviously learned from the fact that when the Yaakov Avinu said that the Eibishter helped me find food for you, so Yitzchak was surprised. He says, Zakel Kel Yaakov, you're speaking like Yaakov, because Esav doesn't speak. It mentions Shem Shamayim. So Yitzchak knew that Esav wasn't the tzaddik he was making himself out to be. So how could you say that Esav was deceiving Yitzchak with these questions of how to tithe on the straw? When it answered, so the Alter Rebbe answers in Torah as follows. The Alter Rebbe is going to answer, and we had a sikh on this at length in Chelek Tezvav, that there's two parts of Esav. There's the chitzenius of Esav, the part of Esav that comes down into this world, and then there's the shayrish of Esav, the source of Esav, which is the spiritual element of Esav, which is on a very, very holy level. As a matter of fact, it doesn't bring it here in the sikha, but it's brought in Chassidus that Esav is higher in his shayrish, in his root, in his source. Esav is higher than Yaakov. Says the Alter Rebbe, when Empharet as Esav is Dolamata, Umitzad Apnimiyus is the ancient Shemai Shago Befif. When you see Esav in this world, especially when you're looking at it on a deeper level, but within the confines of this world, you see someone that does not have the name of Hashem on his lips. But Esav is in Zayin Sherish, but Esav, as you see him in his source, in his origins, which is connected to him in this world, except in the level of Makif, it only encompasses, it doesn't permeate. Esav in his shayrish is a very high level of Kedusha. As the expression goes, Reisha de Esav ba'atfui de Yitzchak. Literally it means that Esav's head is in Yitzchak's garments. But what it means is that Esav begins where Yitzchak ends. So in other words, Yitzchak is the source, and the Yitzchak leads to Esav. There's shaders when Esav Gvura de Klippas, when Yitzchak Gvura de Kedusha. That you have Yitzchak, which is Gvura, as we know that Avram is Chesed, and Yitzchak is Gvura. But by Yitzchak, the Gvura is a Gvura of Kedusha. And then Yitzchak, from Yitzchak comes Esav. Esav is also Gvura, but by Esav, the way he comes down into this world, it becomes Gvura of Klippa. But on the level of Makif, and the level of Makif, Esav is very holy, and Itaka wants to know how to give Meiser, how to tithe from straw. And therefore Yitzchak wanted to give the brachas to Esav, because he wanted to draw down this holy root, this holy source of Esav into this world. Because Yitzchak feels that if we were able to reveal the holiness of Esav in this world, this would refine and transform Esav. This is what the Alter Rebbe says in Torah. That Yitzchak knows who Esav became in this world. But he says, Esav has an incredible holy source. If only we can draw down that source into this world, it could transform the Esav of this world, that even the Esav in this world should tithe properly, and it should become Shem Shamayim Shagar B'fiv, he should mention the name of Hashem. So that's what Alter Rebbe says in Torah, which gives us a whole new, obviously it's here very brought down very concisely, but a whole new understanding in Yitzchak's relationship with Esav. He's not blind, and he's not pulling the wool over his eyes. He knows who Esav is, but he believes in the potential of Esav, if we would reach into the root and source of Esav and draw it down into this world. So now that we understand that these two elements, there's the external part of Esav, which needs a lot of help, but there's also the source and the root of Esav, which is very holy. Now we can understand that the fact that Esav brings up how to tithe salt and straw specifically, because these things represent the refinement and the transformation of Esav. Steht in Chassidus as Melach is the Sheresh Kol HaGvuros. This brings us a very famous mimer in Likutei Torah, V'leitas Bes Melach. But there it explains that Melach is the root of Gvura. Und der Fahr ist Melach mamtek dinim, weil die Eina Gvuros nitaken ele b'sharshan. That's why Melach has the power to be mamtek dinim, to sweeten the severity. In other words, when you have an issue of Gvura, in order to change it, you got to go back to its source. That's how it works. And since Melach is the source, is the root of Gvura, therefore Melach has the power to sweeten Gvura. But so that's what I mean. That's a mimer unto itself, and here it's written in 2 lines. But kumtois as nim'inyi from asines hamelach. So if you're talking about tithing the salt, is merum is the bit of a good as the Esav. You're going to the salt, which is the root of Gevura, and you're tithing it, which means to say you're elevating it. You're transforming the Gevura of Klippa of Esav into holiness. So Esav says, "How are you ma'aser es hateven?" is referring to the fact that there is a possibility of transforming and elevating Esav by going back to the shadish, to the root of Gvura, which is salt, and elevating it. But then the same concept would be with the straw. Wie steht in Chassidus as moitz v'teven sheinem rak psoilas achita, that the chaff and the straw are only the waste product of the wheat. That represents klippa, the wheat itself, the kernels. That's the peri, that's the fruit on the inside. That represents the holiness. The straw on the outside, the chaff on the outside, the stuff that flies away. That's the klippa. That's the shell. So teven represents klippa. Und der Vater is Esav, the Klippa, and therefore Esav, who is on the side of Klippa, Shibach Atzmai, is praising himself. Shenosan Meiser Mimoitz V'Teven, that he's giving Meiser from straw and chaff. So it meaning to say that he is elevating the Klippa, so he's priding himself with that. But what does it show that on the deeper level, when he gives Meiser from that, he's giving Meiser from Klippa, again, he's elevating and transforming Klippa. So when Esav asks the question specifically about melach and teven, about salt and straw, is because those are the things that represent the klipa of Esav, that Yitzchak is hoping can be elevated, and Esav is reminding Yitzchak, so to speak, that he can be elevated if these things were transformed. When the far state beim Bilder von Esav Lasalav, and this connects with the fact that when it talks about the transformation of Esav, when Mashiach comes, the house of Yaakov will be fire, the house of Yosef will be flames, Esav lakash. And Esav is going to be straw, because straw represents klipa. So when Mashiach comes, the fire is going to burn up the klipa of Esav. May we marry this speedily in our days with the coming of Mashiach. So Bekitzer, we asked in the beginning of the Sikha that this seems to be the ignorance on the part of Esav, and why didn't he notice that Yitzchak was not tithing? We answered, there's a different kind of meiser, a meiser that did include salt and straw. Then we focused on the word medaktek, and we said, what does it mean heyach? What does it mean how to tithe? And we explained that Esav was asking, do you look at the current value, or do you look at the value of it once it is mixed in with something else? Which explains the word medaktek, which means to calculate things specifically. Then we spoke about the word ma'asrin. Why does Rashi say ma'asrin if the Medrash says metaknin? And we explained that it's machlekes Rambam and Ravid. The Rambam holds that it wasn't meiser, Ravid holds that it was meiser. So therefore, according to the Rambam, there was no meiser before Matan Torah. That's the shita of the Medrash, and therefore they say mesaknin, because there was no meiser. Whereas according to Rashi, it's following the shita of the Ravid, that there was meiser before, and therefore it's the hech ma'asrin. And the Yenishal Torah explains what's Kash and Teven, Teven and Melach and Teven. Melach and Teven represents the Klipa of Esav, the Gevura, and the Klipa of Esav that is on a very low level, but being that there is a higher level, a shayrish of Esav, it's a very high level of Kedusha, then if we could be Mevarer, the Kash, the Melech, and the Teven, then we can elevate Esav and transform him, which Yitzchak was hoping to do through the brachas, but it will not happen until Bias Mashiach Tzidkenu.